Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Danielle Tam Claiborne, and I'm the co-executive director of the Serica Initiative, a New York-based nonprofit organization that galvanizes a global community of changemakers to advocate for greater Asian American inclusion and advance positive social impact in U.S.-China relations through dialogue, storytelling, and our convening power. We're here tonight to celebrate the launch of Serica's newest film collaboration with WNET, PBS's largest national affiliate, on an initiative called Exploring Hate, which investigates the roots and rise of anti-Semitism, racism, and extremism in America. Our series, Between Black and White, Asian Americans Speak Out, is a three-part series about the challenges and opportunities for allyship and solidarity between Asian Americans and other communities of color. The first episode, Bridging the Divide, about how the Black and Asian American communities in one San Francisco neighborhood are working together to confront racism and misperceptions about one another, just premiered last Thursday. Our second episode, which is on Jewish-Asian relations, premieres in 2 days. And that's what we are here predominantly to talk about this evening. So before we get underway, I just want to share with you all a very brief clip, sneak preview. So this is never before seen outside of the WNET studio. So I will just play about a 3-minute clip, and then I will share some background about our wonderful panel this evening, and we'll get into the discussion.
I think when people think about commonalities between the Jewish community and the Asian American community, they often lean on model minority tropes like, oh, they're both really into education, and like all these other things that are sometimes true and sometimes very much not.
This really flattens both communities, and the reality within the Asian American community, there's a tremendous diversity.
I think calling Jews or Asian Americans the model minority sets us apart from other minorities in kind of a teacher's pet sort of a way.
It's not a good thing. It's really part of a political strategy to divide communities, to say, you know, if you are quiet and don't speak out, that's what a good minority does. And when you do speak out, when you are vocal, that's being a bad minority.
When I think about the cyclical nature of anti-Semitism and anti-Asian racism, I think the simple answer is just that in both cases we are an easy scapegoat.
I think we're living in a time that's really polarized. I think we're living in a time where things are harder and less predictable. And I think in those moments, people look for folks to blame.
Because we're perceived to be successful or hardworking, these anti-Semitic tropes of control or conspiracy theories manifest. And I see the same thing happening with Asian American communities, especially as the rivalry between the US and China heats up. This sort of xenophobic tradition that our country has had for over 200 years, we see that really bubbling to the surface against both the Asian and Jewish communities right now.
I think both communities are always going to be one national emergency away from being the target of hate in this country. When I say that, I'm talking about things that happen on the geopolitical level in Asia, things that happen in Israel.
If we want fairness and dignity and respect for one community, we have to fight for fairness, dignity, and respect for all communities.
The fact that the conversation around race is usually black and white, I think means that people are disregarded, that if they don't fit into one camp or the other, that basically their experiences are considered secondary.
In order to achieve the promise of true equality and true equity, we do need different groups to work together in ways that are transformative, that allow us to actually understand our both different and common experiences, to share power, and to ultimately work towards common goals.
So growing up biracial, there's huge potential there for those of us who understand completely what it means to be a part of multiple traditions, to see how well things can come together and see how well things can harmonize.
All right, we'll pause there. And we'll have to wait for Thursday for the thrilling conclusion. But as many of you know, but not all of us may, Asian Americans and Jewish Americans share not only a National Heritage Month, which is this month, by the way, but also longstanding ethnic and cultural discrimination in America due to the two groups' distinction and burden of immigrant success. So you heard some of that reflected in the series itself. Hate crimes in the US are up, with anti-Asian and anti-Semitic attacks really fueling that spike. So really, what are the historical parallels between the Jewish and the Asian American communities, and how can we better forge solidarity against hate? So those are some of the topics we're we're here to talk about this evening. And what better group to talk about them than this distinguished panel that we have for all of you tonight. So I'm really delighted and excited to share a little bit about each of them. I won't read the full bios just in the interest of time, but I'll go ahead and drop this link in the chat, which has a little bit more information on everyone, should you wish to read more. But I'll go ahead and get started with Shira. So Shira Lowenberg is director of AJC, the American Jewish Committee's Asia Pacific Institute. Previously, Shira worked for multilateral and international organizations, including the UN Department of Peacekeeping operations, as well as the UN Development Program. Next, we have Rabbi Mira Rivera, the first Filipino-American woman to be ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary with a master's in Jewish studies. And she is rabbi in residence for JCC Harlem, as well as the Lunar Collective, which we profiled in that series as well. We can talk a little bit as we go on too. Kathy Schlund-Biles is a professor of English and Asian American Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, and was previously a Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of English and Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut. And finally, we have Charity Espiritu, who is the Deputy Director of the Asian American Foundation, leading the anti-hate portfolio and bringing nearly 20 years of experience in philanthropy, social impact, and public service. And also, we're hugely indebted to TAF for being one of the main funders and supporters of this home series. So really grateful to have Charity and grateful to have you all here. So the way this all will work is we'll have a little bit of a discussion for about 30 minutes, and really we want to engage with all of you. So please don't hesitate to send us questions, engage with us, tell us what's on your mind, and we'll be able to open up the floor for Q&A in the second half of the hour. So I want to start with you, Kathy. Something that Rabbi Mates mentioned in that video clip that we all saw is race relations in this country are often viewed through this lens of black and white, with Asian Americans, kind of caught somewhere in the ether, somewhere in between. You authored a book on Asian Americans and Jewish Americans grappling with their model minority status, as well as the contested nature of citizenship. So I'm curious, from your perspective, where do Asian Americans and Jews fit into that binary historically, and has the conversation at all shifted in the time since you published that book?
Well, thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be part of this and to be part of a panel filled with absolutely amazing participants and panelists. So thank you so much. So in getting to the wonderful question that you have asked, I want to actually highlight the degree to which, it is understandable in some ways that race and racialization in the United States is understood as black-white when we think about enslaved people and those who are not enslaved, right? But we could actually include indigenous subjects as individuals who also fall in between those two parameters. And I could kind of go on and on about the history of that, but I do want to actually narrow my attention to citizenship, which was actually something that I focused on exclusively in that project and since. And so the original 1790 naturalization law, the law by which individuals who are immigrants can become citizens, actually has as a requirement the assertion that you must be a free white person. So at the time that law is enacted, and it's a constitutional, kind of declaration, many Jewish leaders actually celebrated the fact that there was no religious requirement for citizenship. So this distinguished the United States from other nations, right? So on the one hand, Jewish subjects benefited at that particular moment as free white persons, but then on the other hand, who is left out but indigenous folks, those who are enslaved from Africa, and then African Americans, right? So built into this understanding of citizenship is a racial requirement. And what you see historically as new immigrant groups come into the United States, that notion of what constitutes a free white person, and then after 1870, when the law is amended to include those of African descent, you start seeing within the law and understandings of citizenship a black or a white subjectivity, if that makes sense, right? And Asian Americans fall between that gap. So I go into that history, and I could do more with that. And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm engaging that history like stereo hookup instructions, but the connection to me between Jewish Americans and Asian Americans is pretty crystal clear when we turn our attention outside the United States to Mein Kampf by Hitler. And in an unpublished section of Mein Kampf titled Subjects and Citizens, Hitler applauds the United States because due to its, quote, efforts made to conform to at least partly the councils of common sense. So let me just rephrase. By refusing immigrants entry if they are in a bad state of health, and by excluding certain races from the right to become naturalized citizens, they have begun to introduce principles similar to those on which we wish to ground the people's state. And I know that the recent Ken Burns documentary takes this up, but it is this idea that it's actually through immigration and naturalization policy that you are allowed to exclude, discriminate, and then get rid of subjects deemed unworthy or undesirable. And Jewish Americans and Asian Americans have historically been deemed inassimilable on the grounds of race, religion, and operating outside of a Christian construct. So that is one way in which they are connected. The other way in which they are connected is that there is an invisibility with regard to their discrimination, right? So on the one hand, anti-Semitism and anti-Asian hate is acknowledged, but then on the other hand, it is deemed somehow less serious because there is not this master narrative of like slavery, or there's not this like civil rights movement that is completely legible. Right. So I'm not sure if I've answered the question completely, but, kind of drawing to a close, I do think that what connects all of these groups are contestations over citizenship and the idea that what benefits one group does not necessarily benefit other groups. And at various moments in history, groups that were privileged may end up being marginalized. So Asian Americans may be elevated in the mid-60s as mono minorities, but then in an age of COVID, they are deemed perpetual foreigners and like kind of contagious subjects. And I think the same can be said for Jewish Americans. So I'll stop
Thanks
there.
so much, Kathy. Yeah, no, I think that harkens a lot to what John Osaki mentioned in the clip we saw too. Is sort of both groups are one national emergency from being this kind of eternal scapegoat, and so I really appreciate what you said with regard to that history and the context around citizenship. Shira, I'm wondering if you two might be able to speak to some of that linkage between these two groups, some of the history, but also in some ways some of the misperceptions as well. Certainly, given that there are these sort of joint trajectories and the way in which these two groups are sort of lauded, of course, in times, in good times, as model minorities and deemed as foreigners in other times, perhaps there is some misperception around this kind of idea that, quote unquote, Asians are the new Jews, and sort of that narrative that's become increasingly popular in media and in pop culture. Are there some thoughts you have with kind of couching kind of how that came to be and maybe where some of the misperceptions around that are?
Thank you. Like Kathy, I'm going to echo her thanks for having me on this illustrious panel. So thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. Just to carry through on what Kathy said, she mentioned the model minority, and Daniel, with your question as well. I think part of the linkages between the groups are the common immigrant experience. Although it may have happened in different waves of American history, we did come in as immigrant groups. Of course, it's varied, but for a good number, certainly of American Jews, and the Asian American community is a very large and diverse community, but fleeing oppression, coming for the land of opportunity. And there are some stereotypes that have been associated with both Jews and with Asian Americans that you can argue there's a fine line. There are some very positive ones, but they do have a darker connotation. So that we are very hardworking, The immigrant experience shows that people come in without education, make a lot of sacrifices, and their children enter the middle class through education, are rich, family-oriented, the model minority myth. And you see that, I mean, just taking the wealth is one example. Certainly in the Jewish community and in the Asian community, there's a great range. There is great poverty also within both communities and great wealth. So that's one thing, the immigrant experience and the model minority. The other, also touched upon by Kathy, is the white adjacent. And there are, again, I won't speak so much of the Asian American experience, but certainly for the Jewish. So you look at me and I have Ashkenazi Jewish background, but it's a very, very diverse community if you see Rabbi Mira Rivera and others. My colleagues in the Asia Pacific Institute of American Jewish Committee are Japanese American Jewish and Indian American Jewish. So there is a great deal, and it is it's an extremely diverse community. So I would emphasize those linkages, and I'll probably pipe up with other responses as we move along.
No, that's perfect, Shira. Yeah, I think that the sort of the range and the diversity of experience is something that often gets papered over when you think about the model minority myth. Trying to essentialize and really compartmentalize these groups into one specific narrative. So that's absolutely right. And speaking of sort of multiracial or multicultural Jewish Americans, Rabbi Mira, I know you work with many of them, especially within the context of being the rabbi in residence for the Lunar Collective itself, a sort of consortium of Asian Jews. And I was curious from your perspective, for people who fit into both categories, especially, many of the folks you work with, sort of young people, is there a feeling of kind of existential relief that comes with having found that community, or there's still tensions that exist?
There are definitely tensions, but what has been different really in this short time that I've been in community with the Lunar Collective, we are AsianJews.org, is that the more we are in contact with each other, first it was a lot on Zoom during the pandemic, and then now the more we have in-person celebrations and book clubs and dinners and just doing things together, there is more shared laughter. There is more shared, like we could all raise our eyebrows together and go like, really? Really? As is like like this really kind of like tongue in cheek, like, but very poignant, like palpable sense you get when you look at the YouTube videos that have been produced by the Lunar Collective on YouTube. So it's both and, right? And when we are in community, for example, during a Passover Seder, and it is one that is run by Lunar, and we center the experiences of Asian Jews, and we are there with our partners and our families, and all of that becomes nuanced because we live in the United States. There's just unbridled joy, and for us to pray together, like to even do like an evening service before we eat, suddenly I'm looking at family, like literally snap family. So tensions really exist when we are out there, interfacing, and dealing with the microaggressions that still continue. But now what we've discovered is, if we can, create community for us, hopefully, we get bolstered. And hopefully when we have to be in those other communities, we always remember like the kitchen, where all our aunties will be around the table, right? Where we can go and find support and joy.
I love that, Rabbi Mira. Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the great privileges we had as shooting as part of the series was to film a Passover Seder in LA and which was happening at the same time as one in New York. And so it was really fun to see that dynamic play out, and the kind of the joy and the uplift that was really sort of brought out by the community. And I think one of the really interesting things about Lunar is that they were sort of born out of this moment of extreme pain, this rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Asian hate kind of coming at the exact same moment. But since then have really doubled down on finding joy and celebrating joy as a community. But of course, there are those very real tensions and those issues that continue to plague our communities. And that actually leads me to my next question for you, Charity. Thinking about violence and discrimination against Asian Americans, against Jewish Americans, can you talk a little bit about what's happening on the ground, kind of where you sit at an organizational level, and then what organizations like TAF are doing to sort of combat and address those issues?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for the question, and thank you for putting together such a great panel. I'm just super humbled and honored to share the space with all of you and to have this important conversation. So thank you so much. To answer your question, I think the reality is that there is a deep sense of grief in the community, right? There's a deep sense of fear, both real and perceived. And there's profound loss of lives, and a loss of one's sense of safety and belonging, that extends to the larger Asian American community and extends to other communities that are also targets of hate. So when I think about how we at TAF, Asian American Foundation, have been responding to hate, to protect our community, I think about how we've provided support to victims and survivors all across the nation since we were formed in the context of the Atlanta spa shootings in 2021, right? And I think about the beginning of the year, only this year, we haven't stopped. We responded to the Monterey Park mass shooting, the Half Moon Bay mass shooting, the 18-year-old Bloomington, Indiana student who was stabbed multiple times on a bus because the attacker thought that she was Chinese and would be, quote unquote, one less person to blow up our country, right? So I think about all of that and all the way to today, when we're still in the midst of responding to and providing support to victims and survivors of the Allen, Texas mass shooting done by an anti-Asian, anti-Jewish, a lot of things, extremist. And I think about the little boy who survived that shooting, 6-year-old William Cho, whose mom and dad and little brother didn't make it alive. And there is a long process of recovery and healing that needs to happen, especially for William and his family, but also for the larger community that has ever heard or touched or engaged with the stories that we heard from the ground. So the reality also is that, combating hate requires a tremendous amount of partnership and collaboration within the Asian American community and with other communities that, right, unfortunately, we have the commonality of being impacted by hate-fueled acts. And we cannot do this alone. Right? If there's anything that I ever say here that I would love for you to take away is that we cannot do this alone, right? We look to our partners at the national and local level to combat hate. So we have partners like the Anti-Defamation League, the SICK Coalition, the National Urban League, Stop API Hate, and Asian Americans Justice Center. So there's so much that we need to do, especially in the area of prevention, right? We cannot wait until another member of the community is attacked. We can make a huge difference when we provide resources to locally based organizations to strengthen community resilience. Right, and that is the key for us, is to strengthen community resilience. So I will plus one Rabbi Mira in saying that, so the reality really is both and, right? It's both horrific and also full of possibility to drive meaningful change.
Thank you so much, Charity. Yeah, and I really echo that sentiment too. I think that that sense of being of kind of working within both communities, and I think the ADL certainly has that history of working amongst the Jewish community, but of course is brought into, include people of all backgrounds. And I think the work that Asian American specific organizations that are doing to cross those borders and really form alliances with other communities is critically important. Again, just because we can't do this work alone. And so I kind of thinking about organizationally how those partnerships have developed. I want to also ask you, Shira, sitting from a different organizational seat with AJC, another very strong historical organization that's really focused around these issues of hate and anti-Semitism. How has your work been influenced, changed, challenged by this dual rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Asian hate? Does this feel more profound than perhaps the history of AJC has sort of led up to this moment, and kind of what are you doing as an organization also to sort of build bridges and collaborate and confront this hate?
Big question. So American Jewish Committee was founded in 1906. So since that time, of course, there have been different rises and falls in the levels of anti-Semitism. And I can speak to what has been more recent, and there definitely has been more of a focus of our work. But since 1906, we have worked with other community organizations, both ethnic communities and religious communities. So it's not just the AAPI community, but also Latino community, Black, religious minorities. So we have a Muslim Jewish relations team. So there has been a lot. I will say that over the last couple of years, with this spike, or at least spike of reported anti-Asian hate and the spike in anti-Semitism, we have unfortunately found greater, reason to work much more closely together on anti-hate initiatives. And I could share with you a very, very pages long list of only the last 3 years of what our 24 regional offices across the United States have been doing just with the Asian American community. So, to, I think, repeat what Charity highlighted, allyship is really, really important. When a community is feeling under threat, of course, it's great for people within the community to speak out about it, but it's even more powerful when others speak to it. It legitimizes it, and it also, people trust people who are like them or who they know. So if someone from your own community is testifying that this is actually happening, this is a threat not only to them, but to the well-being of all of us, that's a very powerful thing. Just to answer a little bit more of your question, so things like attending rallies, tweeting, being on social media, supporting each other like that has happened a lot. Writing joint op-eds. Our former CEO, David Harris, had written an op-ed very early on in the pandemic with Representative Grace Meng. AJC had spearheaded an effort for the passage of the No Hate Act that was passed in May of 2021, both with Muslim organizations and with Asian American organizations. And I know that the Asia Pacific Institute spearheaded an effort with more than 50 signatories of Asian American organizations. So all that and more. And if you look historically, I was just last week, I was in California for a visit to Manzanar, the incarceration camp of Japanese Americans that's just outside of Los Angeles. And American Jewish Committee was the first non-Japanese American organization to sign up with, or to advocate for the apology and reparations that were given to Japanese Americans. So that was, we were there then. This trip was extremely powerful. So there's a lot that we have been doing and will continue to do, and rely on our partners, not only in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, but also other communities to back each other up. And just one more thing that I wanted to point out, I think it goes back to your previous question, but about the the stereotypes that exist about Jews and Asians. There's also the dual loyalty, which is especially prevalent now, both for the Jewish community and Asian American community, specifically the Chinese American community, but everyone is kind of lumped up together. So that's another thing that I wanted to mention, because there are a great many similarities in issues that we are together combating.
Thanks, Sherry. I really appreciate that. Yeah. And I think, like you mentioned, there are these really stark examples historically of collaboration between these groups. But I think what was really interesting in going about this series was, and many of you, we talked to as part of this as well, is sort of trying to identify, specific groups or contexts in which Asian Americans and Jewish Americans were really working together. And I think the Lunar Collective was really indicative of this kind of spirit and was really quite unique in that space. It itself is quite a new organization. And I don't think it's because these two groups haven't collaborated in the past, but I think maybe there's just a framing of it and the way we're taught our history is maybe where it's not emphasized as much. I think oftentimes we hear a lot about the civil rights struggle and the place that Asian Americans played in that, whether it's Grace Lee Boggs and her husband, or of course, very iconically, the picture of Yuri Kochiyama sitting next to the prone body of Malcolm X. I think oftentimes we see those race relations a little bit clearer when we look back, but less so perhaps on the Asian Jewish perspective. And so I'm curious from any of you who's really interested in discussing, but I'll pick on Kathy first. Is there, are you sort of surprised by that degree of collaboration? Kind of what you see, maybe even in the university context or elsewhere, and maybe what work still needs to be done there, either to make those narratives more known or to actually push that activism further.
I think that it's a fascinating question. And one of the things that really struck me was that even though the comparison between Asian Americans and Jewish Americans is made by way of model minoritization, when you kind of dig down into it, there's not much more said, right? Like, so, when I was looking at some of the connective histories and connective political experiences between these two groups, what I came to time and again was that there was obviously this connection, but largely it fell into the realm of stereotype and very rarely into a space of action, right? So, and I think that part of the reason for that, seeming segregation between the two groups is very much intentional by way of, again, immigration law, exclusion, and the ways in which we comprehend difference in the United States, right? So I so appreciate you mentioning Yuri Kochiyama, because in some ways, when I ask my students, everybody knows Martin Luther King, people know Malcolm X, but nobody knows who Yuri Kochiyama is, even though she has such an intimate, kind of connection in that photograph to Black liberation and the civil rights movement. But with all of that said, I think that this is the time to think about solidarity as much more than, organizing around one issue. And that's what I really appreciate about not only the panel, but the series that has been produced. And the reason why I raised that, and I didn't get to the last part of the question that you had posed, but one difference that I see now, as opposed to when I published that book back in the day in 2010, is that I really was stuck in this space of the war on terror. Many of my perspectives were, kind of built on what happened after 9/11 by way of targeting South Asian American subjects and also the rise of anti-Semitism. But what has been so alarming is that in an era of Trump and post-Trump, what was previously deemed beyond the pale has now become acceptable, right? So it is now acceptable to articulate white supremacist positions without much pushback. And I think that in terms of solidarity and one of the challenges, I think we can no longer just identify these very racialized, kind of moments to protest against. Because what I see is that in many ways, people who are victimized are then blamed for their own victimization by way of white aggrievement, right? So that didn't really happen. That's not about racism. And so I think that the challenge is to really think imaginatively about what is happening. And one suggestion I have is the issue of gun violence, and to kind of think about what is so often stressed in terms of mental health. But given the predominance of white supremacist thinking, anti-Semitic thinking and Asian, anti-Black thinking that goes into these shootings. I'm wondering why we don't actually seize that mental health angle and say, well, obviously the mental health issue is an investment in white supremacy, right? That, I'm just trying to think creatively because it's so difficult. And I am so impressed by the efforts of my colleagues who are actually doing organizational, institutional, and kind of nonprofit work, because the tools through which we used to organize are now being taken away when you can't even teach these histories, these difficult histories that brought this current circumstance into being. So I'll just end there.
That's absolutely right, Kathy. Yeah, I'm wondering, Rabbi Mira or Charity, if you want to jump onto anything Kathy mentioned too, or even kind of just thinking even more broadly, this idea that there is this great adversarial relationship, I think, amongst peoples and experiences that one doesn't understand, which I think has led to some of these increased tensions and, of course, the rise of gun violence and more. What are some ways that we as individuals and we as communities can sort of address these misperceptions and create better understandings, whether that's educating our communities, educating neighboring communities about our histories and about our backgrounds.
So if I may jump in, so I'm a rabbi. I chose amongst the things I should have gone into real estate or into coding as my second career from being in theater and being in dance. But this has always been my inclination, right? So I chose to work with text. I chose to work with ritual, with the way the Jewish community provides us with a framework for living. So I chose that. And I did choose to marry, my husband, who is of European descent, Jewish European descent by way of Germany and Poland. And so for many years, one would think, and even my colleagues would say, why aren't Jewish communities right? Even on the page of actualizing, say, the sentiments of Martin Luther King Day, for example, we would always say, but I've been told, for example, oh, Asian Jews, like, you're not part of the picture. This is for Blacks and whites, all of that, right? So me waiting for Jewish institutions and beloved synagogues and prayer communities to see us, that was like waiting for the raven to turn white, as my grandma would say, right? Or she would say, I'll write that in water, right? It's never going to happen. And from pleading, and I have colleagues who plead, who work with organizations. So I chose to go to seminary, and what is so clear to me now is that even with the example of Lunar Collective, is there are just some things that are just not going to be on their radar, period. When COVID was equated to, like an Asian virus, maybe that, produce a little bit of rice, oh, that's so bad. That is so, that's just so uncalled for. But I've also been asked, do we have to respond to every single uprising in the country? Right now it's now it's Asians. I mean, this is in the context of us surviving through the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd and all of these other events. Should we respond to all of these? Right? And people like me just said, why are you even asking? Like Jewish ethos says that you have to bury the dead of those who are of other peoples in the same way you bury your own. You have to provide care and succor to the ill of those people who are not your own in the same way as you do as your own. So rather than just waiting for for this manna to drop from heaven, people like Jenny Rudolph and Jen Schlossberg, really those who thought of the beginnings of Lunar, just said, like using their just plain intelligence, like, hey, something is missing here. We can find each other, even though we don't have the answers. And that initial meeting produced like all of the 50 people just showed up and said, yes, we have our stories to tell. So most organizing in the Jewish community around justice has been centered, if there is, and if there is support for, has been centered around raising the voices and centering the leadership of Black and Brown colleagues, the Black and Brown folks. And although this is part of us as our Americans, this is our inherited history, I've asked, where do we fit in? Where do we have to go through the kitchen door and to go to the alleyway to discuss these, or do this in the hallway? So while we do all of these things and stand in solidarity, a lot of us have just said, no, this is do it yourself, right? I, as a person who went through an institution, will support with what I know, and my colleagues will just, go through the other kind of organizing like we're doing at Lunar. So I am in step with them. I am not leading in that sense, but I feel like my leadership is about being in step with those who have energy and those who have the chutzpah and those who just said, guys, we got to take this in our hands.
I appreciate that, Rabbi Mira. Yeah.
For our well-being and for love and community, and so that people are not don't fall through the cracks.
I think there is that interesting kind of dichotomy of, do you push an existing institution to sort of do better, right? Or do you decide I'm actually just going to forge my own path, seeing an absence that I need to fill? And I'm curious, maybe Charity, from your perspective, this isn't a perfect segue, but thinking about TAF, TAF is a relatively new organization. Kind of how did that kind of come about? Certainly in the wake of the Atlanta spa shootings, there are, of course, many organizations focused on anti-Asian hate, Asian American rights and advocacy. How did those conversations around TAF get started? And kind of what was that driving force? Was it kind of institutionally things aren't moving, we need to allocate more dollars towards Asian American philanthropy, and so we're going to kind of start our own thing? Or was it a different thought process?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, I mean, I think it's that certainly the data on how much how much of the philanthropic dollars are really invested in the API community and organizations and leadership. I mean, that's certainly, part of the driver. I think what resonates, I think, with me, with what Rabbi Mira said is it's really about who are we centering? Who are we centering? And I think for the Asian American Foundation, it's about centering our stories and the diversity of this community. We want to make room for all kinds of perspectives and stories and origins, and learn how to work with that kind of diversity. Because, as many of you know, right, the API community is not monolithic, right? We're not all engineers and doctors with Yale degrees, right? We're farm workers, we're bank tellers, we're Uber drivers, actors and writers, like all kinds of things. And so we can't keep telling each other, let's unite, when we haven't made way or made room for our differences and how to work with that kind of difference. And until we do that, then we aren't able to develop a common goal. And so I think in so many ways, TAF entered the scene with that in mind, figuring out how do we have these conversations and bring folks together, day by day, step by step, and figure out how, what is that common ground? What is that common goal? And how do we support each other and be appreciative of our histories and uplift that and elevate that, because we want to center, we're centering ourselves and our community and our stories.
Thank you, Charity. Really appreciate that.
If I could just add, Daniel, before,
turn it right over to you, Shira.
From
Perfect.
both Rabbi Mira and Charity's comments, I think that, there's some reflection on the need for education within our communities. But I also see something very hopeful with the creation of Lunar, with the creation of the Asian American Foundation. As new organizations, there is an evolution. And I would say, I'm touting my own organization, American Jewish Committee. There is a very long history from our origin of standing up for social justice and of working with different communities. I can't speak, of course, in the personal way that you can, Rabbi Mira, but I think that there has been a lot of positive change. And the other thing, based on both of your comments, is political empowerment. And the Jewish American advocacy is older than Asian American advocacy, but Asian American advocacy is catching up. And I also see in the last 10 years, many of the Asian American organizations, and correct me if I'm wrong, are fairly young in comparison with some other ethnic groups. And that's for many reasons. But I think that political empowerment is a key to a lot of change. And Asian American organizations of the various groups that make up the community are gathering strength in that way. And that's really encouraging.
I've been thinking a lot as you were speaking, Shira, about sort of these touchstone moments in Asian American history, whether it's civil rights and kind of the founding of Asian American even as terminology, right? And sort of that kind of collective ethos really coming into consciousness, to Vincent Chin, obviously in the 80s, all the way through LA Uprising. Are we at a kind of groundswell moment here as we're thinking about Asian American kind of empowerment, agency, advocacy, as well as an opportunity to really work with other communities? If the answer, regardless if the answer is yes or no, what is kind of on the docket right now? What's sort of at stake in terms of the agenda for what those community coalitions are hoping to achieve? So I'll kind of throw this out. I imagine each of you may be coming in from a different perspective, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. And I'll make one more pitch for the audience members to submit your questions while we've got a little bit of time left. Or else, happy to go on all day.
Well, I'll start. I think I think that this is a very different moment in terms of what I'm seeing by way of the heterogeneity or just of Asian American activism. I'm just going to speak on that front. Because in the past, it has largely been about various ethnic groups, right? So as a Cambodian American, do I really have the ability or the capacity to engage solidarity with somebody who is Chinese American? These are kind of very different histories, cultural positions, etc. But what I am seeing right now that is actually more hopeful than what my last set of comments might suggest is that it is not reliant on an older generation model. And in fact, it is really younger activists who are leading the charge. And they are doing so in a way that is much more effective. It's much more diverse in terms of messaging. I feel that we are at this very unique moment. We are also, and I'm just speaking for Asian Americans at this point, we also need to contend with the white supremacist thinking in our own backyards. And that is something that I think we need to really address, right? So there is one way to be supportive of Black Lives Matter, but we can't engage strategic amnesia with regard to the fact that 2 of the officers were Asian American, right? Or that an Asian American was, if you look at January 6th, there are a number of Asian Americans involved in that particular insurrection. So I think that moving forward, we need to actually, kind of be real about why our communities are invested in white supremacy, while at the same time acknowledging the need to engage multivalent solidarities and understand that, you know, when we do try to engage, our privileged position as model minorities may initially be something that is off-putting to other groups. I think that like and that's what makes the organizing so difficult. And that's why I'm so inspired by the other people on this panel, because you're able to think beyond those limitations.
I appreciate that, Kathy. I know we talked yesterday about the kind of risks involved with that kind of proximity to whiteness, and that kind of alliance may cause just apprehension, exactly as you said, from other communities looking in. Any other thoughts in terms of kind of where the movement is right now, and kind of what are the key issues that are on folks' mind? I'm sort of tempted to sort of blow things up at the 8-minute mark, talking about affirmative action, which I think, you know, could be a whole other discussion. But I'm just curious, kind of where we see some of the really hot button issues around Jewish Asian solidarity coming to the fore.
In my world, there are, in the Jewish world, there are so many leadership fellowships. I used to always wonder, like from the time you're in high school or even in grade school, there are so many kind of leadership trainings. And I used to always wonder, if everybody's becoming a leader, who's a follower? Right, and I just, you know, more and more, I just think, yes, like that it should help us develop this sense of responsibility for the collective, for real, right? That everyone is responsible for each other. And so I see, though, that an in-reach into Asian Jews, for example, is yet to be a flood of invitations, right? People would say to me, oh, I don't know, like where the Asian Jews are. And it's just like, and I always say, you want to know about the Ramban from the Middle Ages at 2 o'clock in the morning, all you need to do is use their little fingers and you'll find it. So this kind of still like, oh, lead me, I don't know, I'm blind. This is still part of our thinking, right? So that we even, so taking us seriously is part of the, you know, that's a growing edge. Or we would be told, like my colleagues are told, oh, you're too young to be EDs, to be executive directors. What do you want? Too old, too young, too this, too that. You know, Yale, not good enough, or this university, not good enough. And it just really makes my eyes, I just want to go like this and like stick toothpicks in my eyes and just say like, I don't understand. So again, I feel that some of the effort of Luna are also to look at other Asian American alliances is a breath of fresh air here. So it's not only Jewish religious organizations or the, you know, or the usual institutions, but this kind of, in many ways, we are being thrown into our own people. So I just say to that, hallelujah, whatever door opens, we will stick one foot and then widen it so more people can come in.
I like that. By hook or crook, we'll pry the door open. It takes all our collective strength. Any kind of last thoughts, sort of on this question of, you know, where Asian Americans kind of and Jewish Americans fit with regard to coalition building, and how that's kind of the future of maybe what this kind of partnership could look like, if perhaps historically we haven't seen these narratives make their way into the history books or into the mainstream. You know, what will it take? I know, Shira, you mentioned, you know, sort of that joint signing of the anti-hate bill and legislation. I think those are really positive steps. You know, is most of the energy right now around kind of focusing on that kind of collective hate, or are there other avenues that feel maybe long lasting in certain ways, or maybe just have other legs outside of purely that kind of discriminatory force?
I could jump in. I think, you know, we focused a lot on the anti-Asian hate and or anti-Semitism and coalition building, but I think the coalition building is wider. There are other minority groups. I think that one of the dangers with the white adjacency and also the model minority that both Asian American Pacific Islander communities and Jewish communities fit into is a way of then dividing us away from other minority groups. And that's very dangerous. And needs to be combated. So I wanted to say that. I think that there is a lot to also celebrate with the communities. I think that there is a need for education within our communities to know our histories and to appreciate them, to appreciate the contributions that our communities have made to the United States, to the American, to the rich culture that we have. And there is a great deal of ignorance within the Jewish American community, and I cannot speak for other communities, but I'm suspecting that there is also some need for education there as well. Within the American Jewish Committee, I mentioned that we have 24 regional offices across the United States. I know that one of my colleagues, who is the director in Philadelphia, created an organization with others. The acronym is PAPAJA, which is the Pennsylvania, I have to look in my notes exactly what it stands for, which I can't find.
Not to be confused with Papa John's. This is important.
No. But it's an Asian, it's the Pennsylvania, Asia Pacific Jewish something other, but it's a statewide coalition that's working on issues that of commonality at a statewide level, at a government level. And those kinds of examples of working, of course, against, combating bad things, but also towards positive things for our communities. And again, for the broader communities and well-being of all minorities and all Americans is something that we can and should be working towards.
Thank you, Shira. And actually, that's a perfect segue into my lightning round last question. Thank you to an anonymous attendee who wrote, and I'm sort of going to meld these questions together, but I was curious, maybe we could just go around and just say, one organization, it can be yours, or it can be, something quite separate from yours, who've put out really great resources, kind of reflecting on some of the topics and the themes we've discussed today, especially given this question, maybe with a bent towards bilingual resources to perhaps elders in the communities who may be less conversant in English. So if anyone wants to kind of start, and we can just go around. All right, Shira.
Okay, I'm going to tout my own organization, American Jewish Committee, that produced a glossary of hate. And it is an online resource that talks about different forms of anti-Semitism and why something is or may not be anti-Semitism. And then I'm going to tout another organization, Committee of 100, which is a Chinese American organization that used the glossary of hate as a model and created a glossary of their own talking about Asian American hate. And it's also an online resource. I'm sure that there are others as well, but these are resources that are available. And I think really important, again, not only for our own communities to understand, but for others as well.
Those are two great ones. That's perfect.
In my work, sorry.
Oh, please go on, Reva, please.
So the Lunar Collective, weareasianjews.org, has several, two seasons of videos around being Asian and being Jewish. And the voice, they're on YouTube, and they're really just beautifully edited and very accessible. And I myself, I actually check in every so often, just, when I'm a little bit tremulous. And we've also produced two Haggadahs. So a Haggadah is a guide for a Passover Seder. And it treats, especially the second one, really gives voice to the different kinds of Asian Jews. This really interesting melange that we are Ashkenazi also sometimes, that we are also adopted sometimes, that we are born of Jewish parents sometimes, and that we are Jews by choice who converted sometimes.
Thank you so much.
I was just going to suggest CRAC, Southeast Asian Resource Action Center in DC. And what I appreciate is that they actually have a leadership advocacy training during the summer. And, not only do they have numerous resources by way of census data, but I also think that the coalitions that they are building are just would resonate with numerous institutions that have been mentioned thus far.
Thank you, Kathy. And last but not least.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so I know we're out of time. I'll mention the Asian American Foundation. Our website has great resources. We have so many partners. If I were to pick one, because I'm in California, we've partnered with Asian Health Services in Oakland. They have an API Action Center or a community healing unit to address some of the to provide resources for victims and survivors and their families and community. In the Midwest, we have a partner, and there's an API Action Center in Chicago with the Chinese American Service League, who's been our partner since last year. Has done amazing work providing in-language resources for those who are impacted by incidents and crimes. And also a major partner in Southern California who, really led the response for Monterey Park, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Southern California, and the AAPI Equity Alliance. So those are some of the few, but we have like 40 plus partners, and please go to our website and check them out. They're doing tremendous work in this area.
Well, thank you so much, Charity. And I just want to take a moment to thank you all so much for being with us here, this incredible panel. I've had a really wonderful time learning from all of you in this discussion. I hope you all in the audience have as well. So please accept my great gratitude with our silent round of applause given our Zoom environment. I'm just going to make one final plug that the series Between Black and White Asian Americans Speak Out, the first episode is streaming live at the website in the chat. And the second episode, which is around Jewish Asian solidarity in the face of hate, is going to be coming out this Thursday. So please stay tuned for that at that same URL. Thank you all so very much for being here this evening, and really looking forward to having a chance to delve into these issues more.